Hey guys, thanks for watching my channel. My name's Don, and my channel's all about fishing after the age of 70. My subject today is an interesting subject. Um, I thought it'd be cool to go out and fish with equipment from back in the 1970s. So today, my I guess the topic would be my challenge to others who are 70 and older to get your hands on an old rod and reel, maybe something that you have, something that a friend has. Take it out for the day and give it a spin. You know, we're so used to the new tackle that's come around in the last, really the last 20 years from the graphite rods. And, the rods are getting longer and longer. The reels are getting faster and faster. Sometimes it's kind of nice to look back on the old equipment that we used to use. This particular video is uh, is really about going back to the 1970s. And some of you may recall, if you were fishing back in those days, rods were a lot shorter back then. In fact, I've got one with me. It's an Ambassador. This was actually one of my rods going way back, probably to 68, 69, made by Abel Garcia. It's a nice rod. It's 6 foot. It's two-piece, which I didn't really like two-piece rods. I don't even know if it'll come apart anymore. But I didn't like two-piece rods. But at the time, uh, if I didn't have a boat and I wasn't able to take the rods with me in the back of a boat, then I found it was pretty convenient to have a two-piece rod. Plus, if I happened to be driving by a farm pond or a small lake, I could get out, walk the shoreline, and do some fishing. So this wasn't my favorite rod, but it was one of many. And I just brought it along here today to show you because there's a lot of difference between the rods from 1970 and the rods from today. One of the first things you'll notice are the guides. I mean, these guides are uh, actually, they have two inserts as opposed to one. They have kind of a red insert and then followed with a smaller insert that's white. All of them are the same, but here's the big difference. There's 5 guides on this rod. 5. That's not very many on a 6 foot rod. It was normal back in those days. Typically, we kind of followed the rule of one guide for every foot, so a 6 foot rod might have 5 or 6 guides. Pretty normal. The other thing that was different was the handle. You know, we see a lot of handles now, they're long. Sometimes they're as much as 13, 14 inches long. And a lot of that is geared towards, being able to kind of jam that handle into your stomach or into your side and then use, the leverage that could obtain from that. The old rods weren't like that at all. Most of them had what we call pistol grip handles. And again, this rod has one. You can see it's shaped kind of like a pistol. They were really nice. I actually liked fishing with them. And again, this particular rod, I've got a half a dozen old rods like this. Um, I just happen to like the Ambassador series, and they came out with them pretty regularly year after year. But in addition to the rod, of course, you need a reel. And the best reel at the time to pair it with was probably an Ambassador 5000. Now, the old Ambassadors were really revolutionary. They replaced many of the reels that were considered to be somewhat archaic when you look back on them. They didn't have a lot of the features that some of these newer reels had. And when they came out with the Ambassador, everybody jumped on board. And it was soon, the 5000 was soon followed by a 5500 C3, and then the 2500, the 6500, the 4600 narrow spool. You know, there were a lot of variations to it, but essentially they were all basically the same reel. So what I did is I paired this up with this rod, took them out for a day, and I thought, I'm going to leave my other rods home. I'm just going to give it a couple hours of fishing with an old rod and an old reel. I had to spool up the reel. I've since taken the line off because this reel and the rod are both parts of my collection. But I spooled it up with some 8-pound test. I think it was trilene, trilene monofilament. So I spooled it up and I put a couple of lures. I put one on and put a couple more in my plastic box that I took along with me. And I decided I'd just hit the lake, try a little bit of fishing with this 1970s outfit. And the first thing I noticed was how incredibly heavy it was compared to some of the rods and reels that I use today. At least it seemed heavy. Again, I'm not 20 years old, so at my age, I guess most rods feel a little heavier than they used to. But I guarantee you the reel is heavier. It's bulkier. It doesn't have that sleek profile that the newer reels have, what they call a low profile. And the gear ratio on these old 5000s, I believe, was 5-to-1. So they weren't a fast retrieve reel, but they were steady. And 5-to-1 wasn't a bad gear ratio. They've got reels now that are, I don't know, 9, 10-to-1. They're so fast that I don't know what you would need a reel to reel that fast for, but it's a good selling point, I guess. But anyway, I got it spooled up, put on a Zero Spook, and I went out and thought I'd just do a little casting along the shoreline. Well, I like to cast parallel to the bulrushes. It gives me an opportunity to kind of work right in front of the bulrushes where I believe a lot of fish hang out because they're looking for bait fish, and it's a great ambush point. So I made a few casts, and of course, my very first cast went about 5 or 6 foot deep into the bulrushes. I was able to retrieve the Zero Spook, but not without having to eat a few bugs in the process. As most of you know, once you get into those bulrushes, those reeds, they're covered with blind mosquitoes and other insects, and it doesn't take long once you disturb them for them to swarm. So I got the bait back, but I was a little more careful on my second cast. So I made a half a dozen casts, and one of the first things I noticed, couldn't cast as far. Now I'm a long, I throw cast out pretty far, and it's because my reels, the reels I use today, they're in good shape. I take really good care of them. I make sure they're oiled and greased, and make sure the setting is right for me. I don't use much of a drag, and usually the setting is pretty light. So, and in some cases, I even have to thumb them because if I didn't, I'd probably end up with a backlash. But I can throw a country mile. I mean, I can throw a lure a long way. And a Zero Spook's the type of lure that you can cast a long distance. But throwing it on this short 6 foot, I say short, it's short compared to most of the rods I use today. But on this particular rod, seemed like I was only throwing it half as far as I normally would. Certainly wasn't the weight of the lure. I mean, it was the same lure I use all the time. And it probably wasn't the line. I mean, I've used 8-pound test line, 10-pound test. In fact, I've gone as heavy as 20-pound mono, 20-pound fluorocarbon. I can still throw it a mile. So, it leads me to believe it was probably the rod. Not necessarily because it was short, although that probably contributed to it, but because it didn't have near the flex or the fast tip action of the rods I normally use. And that's just the way rods were built back in those days. Nobody paid a lot of attention, I think, other than to the fact that they wanted them to be pretty strong rods. And this doesn't even have the information on the rod like a lot of them do today. But I would guess, it was probably rated heavy, if not extra heavy. The joke was back in those days we used short rods, and they were more like baseball bats. And And the other factor I think that contributed to it was, aside from the fact that it was shorter than most of the rods I normally use, with that pistol grip, I didn't get quite the same uh, action or quite the same flex, I guess, in my own cast, in my wrist, in my arm, forearm. It took a little more getting used to before I could really get some distance. For the record, I mean, most people know that, a long rod, 7.5, even 8 foot rod will generally offer you the greatest opportunity to get distance, regardless of the size of the lure you're using. Provided there's enough weight there, you can throw most weights a long, long ways with a 7.5, 8 foot rod. With a 5.5 or 6 foot, you're going to be limited in the distance you can cast. But there's a plus side to that. And the plus side is that on a short rod, you're usually much more accurate. And I can remember for years, using a short rod like this. And my dad used to put a cup or a bucket, started out with a bucket, and we'd have a practice plug on back then we used a lot of spinning rods, but we'd have a practice plug on the end of it, and we'd go out in the backyard and we'd cast and practice casting until we could put that practice plug in the bucket. And it wasn't as hard as you might think. Once we got pretty good at it, once we could get that thing to either be in the bucket or pretty close to the bucket, my dad found a container that was a little smaller than a 5-gallon bucket, and we'd practice trying to cast into that. I can't say that I ever became 100% accurate, but I guarantee you I was a lot more accurate with a pistol grip short rod than I've ever been with these 7.5 foot long-handled cork rods. The difference in guides, I don't think it makes much difference. I mean, I've been a rod builder 50 years. It's interesting back then, everything was 5, 6, 7 guides. You never saw a rod with more than 7. At least I don't remember ever seeing any. Even back when Gary Loomis became really well known with his rod selection, he seldom built a rod where he had more than 7 or 8 guides on it. And of course, I used to buy the blanks, and I used to build a lot of G Loomis. I tried to build them as close as, what the manufactured rod was, what the specs were. But it wasn't really until about maybe 15 years ago that rods started showing up with 10, 12, 14 guides. They also went from a two-pronged, or what we call a guide with 2 feet, one going this way, one going this way, which allowed you as a rod builder to wrap both feet, which made the guide super strong. Nowadays, most of the rods you find, they're single foot. And they're also lighter guides, usually wire guides. Sometimes they have inserts, sometimes they don't. I'm not a big proponent of the inserts, by the way, but depending on the type of line you're using, particularly if you're using a heavier line, or if you're throwing some heavier lures, you might find that they'll wear into the guides. But typically, it's not the guides that are a problem. It's usually the tip. The tip is where the most pressure is applied. Yeah, there's a lot of pressure just from reeling in a lure, but when you put a fish on the end of it, there's a whole lot more, and it's that seesawing effect that can actually damage a guide. But back then, nobody gave it a thought. Everybody was putting about the same number of guides on a rod, so it seemed pretty normal. In today's world, when you see these rods with 8, 10, 12, 14 guides, the only argument I can make for them is it helps support the price. I mean, the cost of fishing rods has gone up dramatically in 50 years, as has everything. But, some of these rods that I have now, they're good rods, but they're, 150, 180, 200, 2 1/4. I got two that are probably in the 300 range. That's a lot of money to pay for a fishing rod. And I mean, I think the argument, the ability to sell that rests on the fact that there's a certain amount of technology that goes into building a graphite rod, making it light, making it sensitive, and giving it a fast tip. But the fact that there's 13 guides on it also helps kind of support, the value. So we didn't have that problem back, in the late 60s and early 70s. But going back to using it, after about 30 minutes, I was surprised at how comfortable I became using this rod and reel outfit. Like I say, I had a few backlashes right off the bat. I missed my target a few times, couldn't cast quite as far, but it does come back to you. And I can remember those days and I mean, some of them were long days. Some days where, I started out early and got off the water late, and I literally casted my heart out all day long. And this is what I was using. I mean, this is the equipment I was using. Heavier than today's equipment, but that's all we had. Incidentally, one of my favorite lures back in the late 60s and early 70s was a kind of an unknown lure. Some of you may recall using it or even hearing about it. Some of you may even have one. I've got about 30 of them. Half of them are still in the original containers, but they're just part of my collection. But it was called a Johnny O'Neill Weed Wing. And what made a Johnny O'Neill Weed Wing so special to me was the fact that it would ride right on the surface. And it had like a little propeller with almost like a Johnson spoon behind the propeller. It was weedless. We'd always rig it with pork chunk, number 11 pork chunk. And I got to tell you, when you threw that thing out and you started bringing it back, and it could be just a level, smooth retrieve, all it was doing was chopping up that water. It would leave a trail of bubbles behind it. Every once in a while, you might slow it down, or you might speed it up, or you might stop it altogether and just let it fall. But I'm telling you, some of the blow-ups on that lure would really make you shudder, because when a bass hits a lure that's moving that fast, they generally hit it pretty hard. But it was a great lure to use in the weeds, a great lure to use in the pads, in the reeds. It didn't hook up, had a nice weed guard on it. In fact, the larger ones had a double weed guard. I always liked the 1/4 ounce, simply for size. And they made them in different colors: silver, bronze, silver, bronze, and black. I normally just used the silver one. And there was, a wide variety of pork chunks you could use, but I always used the one that looked like a frog. I think it was number 11. And there was a trick to using it. And again, with whether you were throwing it with a spinning rod or a bait caster, the key was, before it even hit the water, you'd start to retrieve. And I know that probably sounds a little silly, but what would happen is your bait would be going out, and as it arced and it got close to falling into the water, by giving it a quick, it wasn't a jerk, but because you engaged the reel and started the retrieve, it would take the lure and make sure that it turned the lure around so it was coming back towards you, in some cases before it even hit the water. And in other cases, it would be at the same time that it hit the water. And what that did is that prevented it from getting tangled up, and it kept it on the surface. If you didn't do that, there was a good chance by the time you started the retrieve, it would have already sunk, or at least gone down a few inches, and you'd have to crank it pretty hard to get it back up on the surface. But this outfit, 5000, even though it wasn't considered a high retrieve or fast retrieve reel with a 5-to-1 gear ratio, I had no problem whatsoever getting that weed wing right up on the surface. And when I talk about casting and casting a lot. Again, back in 1972, we all had CBs in our boats, and we'd take them right out of our truck. We'd have a special thing that was hooked up in the truck and another one in the boat. So you could pull the CB out, stick it in your boat, and we were all on the CB all day long, going back and forth with each other, just like we were driving trucks somewhere. But we all had, call names. We all had different names we used while we were on the CB. And mine was, at least for a spell, was the Weed Wing Wizard. And it kind of gives you an indication of how much I enjoyed that fishing lure. But at the same time, a lot of times I'd go out and I'd fish with that all day. I'd never use any other lure. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but it was a hell of a lure. But this rod and reel combo worked really well to handle it. And while I was out on this day of using both the old rod and the old reel, I went ahead and tied on a Johnny O'Neill Weed Wing, and it really brought back the good old days. I was expecting a strike at any minute, which I always do. I was watching the lure. I tend to watch the lure from the time it hits till the time it gets back. And I just expected any minute for there to be a big blow up. And unfortunately, I never got a hit on it. I probably threw it for, 30 minutes, 40 minutes. And believe me, it'll wear you out because it's one cast, reel, one cast, reel, one cast. You knock yourself out. And, again, for me at least, my shoulder wears out, and quite honestly, I just get tired. But what was so remarkable about this combination is I wanted to be very precise in where I put the Weed Wing. And same with the other lures that I used, but more so with the Weed Wing because, if I went too far to the left, I was going to be in trouble. Too far to the right, I was going to probably be in trouble. Even though it was weedless, I knew that it could run across the pads really nice, and it could run across the hydrilla really easily. But when you get into the paddocks that are sticking up out of the water, and sometimes the reeds, if they're too heavy, if it's allowed to slow down just 1 second, if you just don't get that pickup right, you're going to snag onto something. And even with a weed guard, once it hooks onto the stem of that paddock or once it hooks onto that bulrush, you'll play hell getting it back. So anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about today. I want to challenge all you old guys to give that some thought. It's not the kind of fishing we do in 2026. It's really old timer fishing. But some of you may not have the equipment. You may not have the ability to go out and try something like that. Others, I know some guys right now, they've got the first penny they ever made or found. So in all likelihood, they probably still have an old fishing rod laying around somewhere with a bait casting reel or even a spinning reel on it. But the idea is to just go back where we had an opportunity to slow down. Fishing was a little different. We didn't have the high expectations we have today. We didn't have the graphs, and we didn't have the big motors, and we didn't have the power poles and 360 and all the things that make bass fishing what it is today. It was a much simpler time for many of us, at least. We had small rowboats, or maybe we had a small boat with a small motor. But for the most part, bass boats didn't even exist. So this was really a special time. And for those of you that can remember back, if you're like me, you probably treasure those thoughts and the ability to go back with the same kind of equipment we used back in those days. It's a real treat. So anyway, thanks for watching my video today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed the video, please leave me a thumbs up. And, there's a place down below here where you can leave comments. I'd love to hear from you. I try to answer all the comments that I can. And if you enjoy talking about, bass fishing after the age of 70, you might want to subscribe to my channel, because that's what most of my videos are about. So again, thanks for tuning in, and there's more to come.